Those are all available for checkout, and you can check those out on the main floor at the circulation desk. So without further ado, thank you for coming, and here's Dr. Bush.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm just going to launch right into this thing, and I think very shortly you'll figure out where we're going. So here we're going to go looking at the origins of race. We're looking first at a little piece of research that was put out on the net and so on. It's not been refereed, it's not been published yet. It's still kind of cute, so I was going to share that with you. These researchers questioned 447 people who identified with the alt-right and 382 members of a control group who do not identify with the alt-right. The scale asked people to rate how evolved they perceive people or groups to be using a diagram shown in this figure right in front of you there. This diagram depicts the purported biological and cultural evolution of humans from quadrupedal human ancestors. Higher scores therefore indicate humanization, lower scores dehumanization. And this was published on the net, so by the people who did that, they redid the drawing a little bit, put in all the data so we could see that now this is what the extreme right considers, that 91.97% of whites are human. Oh, that's cool, okay. I would have figured a little more than that, but anyway. And Swedes are pretty close. But then when you get down here to Democrats, oh dear, it's not so good. 60% on the scale of 0 to 100 is not really good. But you see, journalists are worse at 58%. And then the feminists, 57%. And Muslims, worst of all, at 55%. These folks are not really human, according to the alt-right. I want to look a little bit more at what we mean by human. And here's where we're going tonight. Constructing race while hiding class. And I'll raise a question for you. Why is President Obama, when he was president, Barack Obama, considered black rather than white? His mother was white, his father was black. We know in this country, if you have any discernible, detectable African genetic heritage by looking at you, bingo, you're not white. Langston Hughes, a great African-American writer and poet, had a little essay on this called One Drop. So that's the indication here, the way we do things in the United States. But you see, logically, he could have been white if the rule was different. If the rule said, if you have 1 drop of white, you're white. But we didn't do it that way. And for reasons of making white superior to blacks, the whole point of that. Now, that raises a question of why is this classification 1 drop and you're black? Obviously, a social construction, meaning that we made it up. Now, sometimes we can make up things just perfectly accurately and find the evidence to prove it later. Some things we make up just with bias, in our own favor. And some things we make up, it's just flat out wrong, no favor, nothing, it's just stupid. We're humans. We can do all of that and have done so. This is obviously a social construction because it could have been done the other way around. There's no biological necessity of this. Yet biological necessity is what's being claimed. Race in this country is a biological thing. except it isn't. Okay, let's work on that a bit. Here's the hard part, but this is where we're going. The emergent properties of the U.S., the way we're organized today as a system, include racial divisions among the middle and lower classes, which benefit the upper class. It's one of the reasons race was created. If we're divided, we cannot take on the upper class. They're small in number, but very powerful. If they divide us through some silly reason, then we can't organize together. And the alt-right, for all their attempts to do the right thing for America and for white people, have been played like a fiddle by these folks. Let's start by asking you a question. I want to know who these people are when I read you a passage from a book. It says, when the vessel finally made her port, husband and wife were often separated. Children under 5 were sometimes given away to serve until they were 21. Soul drivers would purchase 50 or more servants from the captain of one of these ships and drive them through the country like a drove of cattle, offering them for sale to the highest bidder. These new arrivals to the American colonies were European ancestry British, African, Chinese, Egyptian, or South Asian. Now, the usual answer I get is African. And that would have worked perfectly for this description, except this was not a description of Africans. It was a description of European ancestry British being brought over in servitude, sometimes as prisoners, sometimes as hijacked, sometimes they're enticed to come over as maybe and start new in the world here. But they were often labeled as slaves. On the estate records, they would be considered slaves until they were released after a 7-year period. And that, by the way, applied in the beginning to the African slaves as well. So why race? In the early colonial period, slaves greatly outnumbered landowning masters by a lot. It was a little scary if you were in the big house, making all the money, having everybody wait on you, and you had all these folks out working very hard, usually under the whip. You know, that's the way to get them to work a little harder when you have to bring in the harvest. So being outnumbered, that's a little scary sometimes. Harsh treatment to increase profits made it even scarier. Now folks are kind of upset with you. There was fear of rebellion because there were rebellions. And that scared the folks who hadn't been rebelled against yet. How are we going to protect ourselves? Workers, they were often called slaves, were divided by religious positions, Christian and heathen. They didn't see themselves as white or black. I mean, they could tell the difference in pigmentation, but that was not an issue. The issue, were you a Christian? And if you weren't, you were a heathen. And so often the African folk were not Christians, especially in the beginning, and were called the heathen slaves or the African slaves. While the folks we would call white today were called the Christian slaves. This separation by religion, you see, would not be lasting, as non-Christians would convert to be Christians if there was something in it for them. So you could keep this up for a while, but eventually you'd have a whole mob of Christians feeling that you weren't much of a Christian and come after you in the big house. Creation of race laws, it was by the Virginia Assembly in this case. The socially constructed concept of race was invented. This was a biological idea. It was meant to divide workers into 2 races, white and black, supposedly based upon an immutable biological difference. You don't want something that can be changed. You got to keep them separate. And so we began to see race somewhere starting about 1659. So we had about 30 years or more of colonial situation where these workers, slaves, were working hard in the fields as Christian slaves and heathen slaves. And then the race laws came on. Well, that didn't change things automatically. It took about 50 years to really get things going. Little increments of whites could be whipped with their shirt on. Blacks would be whipped with their shirt off. Well, you don't want to get whipped anyhow, but as a little bit of a status difference, this thing sort of starts out, and then they keep building and building and building. And eventually it becomes very clear that there are two races. Now, in that creation of the race laws, it takes about up to 1659 before it starts. Then, till about 1705, passing of race laws to favor Christian slaves and increasing use of the word servant for the indentured whites. And harsh treatment continued for everybody. Some folks got a little tired of this. About 20 years after this all started, we had a gentleman by the name of Bacon who was white, and some other whites get together with some blacks, and they decided they were going to take this place over because it was a kind of living hell for these people. They lost. British sent in Marines from their ships and put it down. Bacon was, executed. By 1691, Virginia finally decided to outlaw mixed marriages. But you had families already existing across this race line. They did not want to be separated. So they, in 1699, gathered a petition for repeal of the 1691 law. It was not repealed. By the early 1700s, whites were feeling pretty darn superior. They're sort of like the folks in the big house. Those black folk, they're not so good. And boy, do we have it today. So, lower class whites settled for a little bit of status. That's all they got out of this. Well, at least I'm white. And for many people, that's all they got today. So class and race are something distinct. And we tend to focus on race and don't understand the issues of class. In colonial America, race was purposely created to split the lower class by race and render it unable to challenge the power of the upper class. Sort of summarizing what we just said. Once instituted, race continued by its own inertia to split the middle and lower classes by race and to focus political issues on race rather than class. It's always been that way. Right through the total 20th century, through all the elections we've had recently, it went through the roof with Obama's campaign for the presidency. And after he was elected, the racism just went sky high. Not going to have that in America. Made it very difficult for him to conduct himself as a president, which he actually did compared to some other people. Okay, suppose markers of race? Well, are there? In the U.S., the principal marker of race is skin color. In the Great Lakes region of Africa, principally Rwanda and Burundi, the principal marker of race is height. The Tutsi are taller, they get to rule. The Hutu and the Twa are short, too bad for them. In Japan, we have another situation. My Japanese is useless, and the conversion from kanji to Roman script doesn't always work very well. I've been saying baraku for years, and I think it's bareku. But I don't know for sure. I'll check that out someday. They are people in Japan who are considered to be subhuman. How do you tell who they are if they have no height difference, no skin color difference? In fact, we're going to talk about them in a little bit as invisible race. But if you know something about the person's surname, of the city or the particular village in which the person was born, the person's dialect of Japanese may give them away too. You can spot these people, and they are mistreated just as greatly as anyone else discriminated by race in other countries, including our own. Now, there are certain problems in forgetting the origins of race. Racial discrimination is not merely a result of a bad attitude. It's just really deep part of a culture. And you will encounter it in many places, and some young people will encounter it all through their upbringing, and it just sort of makes sense to them as they're adults. It can also be a tool in class conflict, as we just said, which most of us won't think about. You know, America's the land of the free and the home of the brave, and just get off your butt and work hard and everything will be all right. Don't live on a rigged system at all, except it's always been rigged, and in the last 40 years it's been extremely rigged. Suppose racial superiority can become an important and enduring part of a person's self-concept. You know, that's who I am. I'll, fly the Confederate flag, but there is no Confederate flag that they fly. Usually it's General Lee's battle flag. Anyway, they think it's a Confederate flag. As attitudes about race are a part of culture, they continue to have effects long after their initial usefulness in class conflict in colonial America, including subsequent class conflicts. They were created at one time, the idea of race. We don't have to recreate that. But all we have to do is do a little dog whistle, talk about this or that, and suddenly you got a whole bunch of people who understand what you're saying, and that race is the issue on the line. You know how to vote now, don't you? But what is white? We always think, well, everybody knows what white people are. The Naturalization Act of 1790 clearly states that white equals English. If these were Englishmen, which most people were at that time, then you're white, okay? And there were controversies over that for ages, and by the time we get to about the 1920s, we have a lot of immigrants who come in for the last 40 years or so, really a lot of immigrants. And we had a really rapidly growing industrial society. We needed a lot of work. But many managers and owners were worried that blacks and immigrants would get together and form strong unions. So lo and behold, what was created in the early part of the 20th century? A new category of people. Caucasians. And at that time, the definition for Caucasian included ancestry from Europe, Middle East, and India. I don't think it does anymore in the popular culture. Okay? By the end of World War II, in the culture, white equaled Caucasian. People just, that's it, Now we know who white people are. That's perfectly clear. That was just everybody understood that. The Naturalization Act of 1965 makes this finally official. Non-English ancestry Caucasian are now legally ethnic whites. Now, I am third generation Irish and German. Great-grandparents came to the United States in the early 1900s. So by this accounting, this kind of line of events, I was born culturally white, but not officially white. In 1965, I became officially white. It's made up, folks. And so it's likely to change over time. How many species of human beings are there on the earth at this time? Most people, just raise your fingers. Let's see how many. Yeah, you got it. There's only one. Don't tell that to the alt-right. Okay, they know that there's more than one. And that whites are the only true humans. All right. In which continent did Homo sapiens originate? Was it Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, or South America? Africa. Africa. We are actually all African if you go back far enough. Okay. Folks of other supposed races or ethnicity would have to trace their ancestry back quite far to get to Africa, but their genetics are pretty much the same. All Homo sapiens on Earth, and we're the only species left, you just told me that, they are very, very similar in their genetics. Which of the following categories of people do not have any of their DNA from Neanderthals? Would that be Native Americans, Europeans, Africans, Asians? All of these? There's a lot of people thinking all. How about all? No, some skeptics here. A few skeptics. Well, the skeptics are right. It's Africans. Africans do not have Neanderthal DNA. The rest of us got between, supposedly, 1.9 and 2.1, and there's some is higher than that even, but that's sort of the mean is somewhere in there, about 2%. It's not bad. We can, of course, the alt-right would be absolutely shocked to find out that their great white folk have Neanderthal genes. But there was nothing really wrong with the Neanderthals. We gave them really a lot of grief in terms of how we accounted for them in the 1850s when they were first discovered. We've learned a lot about them since. And they were another human species. They weren't a race, they were another human species that had been an offshoot of the same species that we had. And we did encounter each other mainly in the Middle East and then in Europe. And a lot in Asia too. So anyway, I don't find that a problem. I'm sure I have about 2% Neanderthal genes. Usually these are the ones that work and do something good for you. That's why they're still here. Somebody had to develop them, and if the Neanderthals got them first, no problem. But I think this is maybe something that the alt-right has overlooked a bit. What is the criteria for races among Homo sapiens? Well, different folks have different ideas about this. Cultural differences? For example, the kind of food or music one likes? No. Race has got to mean genetic difference. Ethnic differences don't count. I mean, a lot of times that is thrown in the mix when people are being racist, but their real objection, they say, is the genetic inferiority of the other beings that they dislike. Genetic differences alone? Well, does not say anything about the kind or magnitude of the genetic differences. Differences so great that human races have very large differences in average intelligence and physical abilities and or moral character. Well, that's what many people believe. It's total nonsense. We have no such evidence whatsoever that we have these big differences. Why should we? We're all the same, basically. Okay? We have minor differences, such as skin color, which was an adaptation, not for Africans, but folks who left Africa, so they wouldn't die. We'll talk about that a little later. So none of the above is according to geneticists. The hominid species Homo sapiens is too young to have developed races? Yeah, there's the correct answer. We don't have real races. We've made it up. And we'll see when we talk about invisible race, if we don't have a nice, neat marker like skin color, not to worry, we can still beat the heck out of folks and make them do the dirty work of society. It's all works out. Is race an erroneous and biased social construction? Absolutely. It's biased in the direction of the folks who had the power to make it up. Okay, so let's look deeper at that possibility. The name game, 2 or more. Long ago, golf champion Tiger Woods grew tired of the questions about his race. So he invented a new race. Caucasian, if I said it right, I don't know. I don't even care. A blend of Caucasian, Black, Indian, and Asian. Well, this gets to be ridiculous after a while when you start going down this road. And that's exactly what we found in Mexico. Let me take a little excerpt here from something I wrote quite some time ago. We really have actual incidents of this other than just Tiger Woods making it up. In the early history of Mexico, for example, the Spanish conquerors kept inventing different names for what they supposed to be new races that resulted from the offspring of various mixed unions. Thus, Mexico used to have many more racial distinctions than it does today. An elaborate terminology was applied to various mixtures of Africans, Native Americans, and Spaniards, and to the resulting shades in skin color and differences in other physical traits. Among the more common terms were mulatto claro, mulatto blanco, mulatto preso, and on and on. I'm not going to go through all these. But you can see that several of these words are names of animals, and of course mulatto itself, like lobo, would be a name of bull. Mulatto itself is derived from mule, implying a cross between 2 different species. They reveal both racial consciousness and the deprecation in which Africans and Native Americans and mixed race persons were held. Over time, it became impossible to keep track of all the supposedly different races. As a result, the whole system broke down under the weight of its complexity. It eventually fell into disrepute, and the result is substantially less racism in Mexico today than we find in the United States. I didn't say 0, okay, but it's not quite what we have with our one-drop business. The evidence from Mexico thus suggests simple racial divisions are easier to keep in place. Oh, and we proved that, didn't we? We kept it simple, and we kept it in place for 350 years. How about that invisible race stuff I kept talking about? Race be invisible. Well, to try and illustrate what authors who talk about this are meaning, I made a little diagram here. On the left, the ellipse is a set of people. Let's just call it a country, I don't know. And the little blue dots are the people. And, a whole lot more than that, obviously. And on the right, that ellipse has a jagged line just drawn through it. I mean, no reason or at all as to why it should have, why didn't it just go straight or nothing at all. Just went through. And so the blue dots were on both sides. But after a while, the race labeled A was told it was superior and began to treat the Bs as inferior. And pretty soon you have a divide that's very significant. The Bs will be considered an inferior race, even though they all started out very genetically similar. Actually, this only takes about 15 minutes. I don't know if you're aware of Jane Elliott's experiment with children. It wasn't really an experiment. She was trying to do a class project. It became more than that eventually, and she trained adults that way up into the 90s. I don't know. She's pretty old now. If she's still alive, I don't really know. And she could get adults feeling put upon, discriminated against within about 15, 20 minutes. She had these kids believing that blue-eyed kids were superior than brown-eyed kids, and the brown-eyed kids were crushed. But on the second day, she changed it around, and brown-eyed kids are superior, and they didn't bat an eye. Yeah, I'm right. And then they wanted to screw over the blue-eyed kids. Us versus them is deep in us. It's part of our lower brain, our primitive brain. You have to really be careful to avoid letting that happen. But invisible race means we have a set of people who are considered to be racially inferior to another set, where there is no genetic difference between them. And technically that can't be race, because there has to be genetic difference. But the people are willing to believe there's genetic difference, even though the testing shows there's none. So some cases of invisible race. In the 1850s, we had a really terrible infestation in Ireland of, it was the potato blight. The British, in their greed to want more potatoes for gin, had forced the Irish to plant things that were way too many potatoes, and it wasn't a smart idea to be doing. Then the blight hit, and then people started starving to death. They didn't have a proper amount of food. Well, those who could make it came to the United States. I mean, going to England, as an Irishman going to England, not so good. And so they thought, maybe if we can make it to the United States. Most of them were absolutely impoverished by this time, because their first thought was, sell your furniture, get food, whatever you can do to stay alive. So the only passage they could get was on freighters, which was just awful, and great advantage was taken of them. But they ended up in places like New York City and Boston, and boy, they were not greeted very nicely. There were so many in such a short time that the local laborers, particularly those who were just into unskilled labor, but some of the skilled laborers, because they would find competitors amongst the Irish, who were living in appalling situations in tenement rooms where the Irish toilet was the alley and the Irish drinking fountain was the pump in the alley. A lot of illness that way. It was a little before germ theory of disease at that time. Things were really bad for them. They were willing to work dirt cheap, and that really undercut the locals, and they were ticked off tremendously. That's going to happen every time. You have a large number of immigrants looking for work, and they end up taking some of the jobs of people who are already there. So the Irish were met with racial slurs. They were considered an inferior race, a bunch of drunken sots. We even saw, I have an article, I wasn't able to get it for you tonight, but a picture from Harper's Magazine in the 1850s. It's a scale, and on one pan is sitting an Irishman, on the other pan a black man. And they're both not portrayed very nicely. And the Irishman looks more like a gorilla than anything else. And the idea was, these folks are equivalent. See how they balance out? They're just the same. And of course, the racism towards blacks at that time was tremendous. So, no Irish need apply, jokes in the newspaper about the Irish, and so they really were considered subhuman. Well, that went away eventually because people were able to get a few jobs and other folks to find other jobs, and general growth sort of absorbed them. And by the 1900s, that wasn't such an issue. Irish weren't all that bad. By the 60s, John Kennedy could run for office. He was no longer subhuman. So did the Irish change their genes? During the 1850s only. Big problem for the Irish. They changed their genes. That's absurd. This is an obvious social construction. The whole reason for it was labor supply. And so we had an invisible race for a while in this country. You could not really tell them from other North Europeans very well, a few redheads, but generally not. And they were subhuman, and then they weren't. In Japan, we still have them today. As I mentioned to you before, the Baraku, up to the present day, they are considered subhuman. Long ago, they did things that the more religious folk didn't like meat cutting and garbage handling and bad stuff. So a name for them that has been there for ages was Eta. It's translated here as meaning extreme filth. Hinning, non-human, and the glorious one, Yatsu, four-legged. I mean, if you haven't got the idea that we have dehumanization here, you're missing it by a mile. Okay? That's the way these folks are looked at. And they've formed organizations to try and get better treatment in the society, but the prejudice is still extremely strong. There is no genetic difference. We didn't test the Irish in the 1850s. We didn't have the testing ability to do so. We know that the Barakumin are genetically Japanese. They're not different, but they're treated differently. In this book, Japan's Invisible Race, they give the example of a Baraku woman who decided she'd had enough of the mistreatment and she was going to sort of pass for Japanese. Worked on her dialect and lied about where she came from and everything, and ended up marrying a corporate executive, and things were going fairly well until one day she comes back from being outside the home and finds what her personal possessions crudely crammed into a couple of suitcases on the doorstep, meaning we found out who you are, and you're not good enough to come in this house one more time to even get your possessions. I mean, the discrimination is real. So, what's the point? Well, isn't it clear? If you want to play skin color game, that's not even necessary, for heaven's sakes. You can just make up any kind of crap you want, and you can put other people down if you have the power to do so. And you'll say all along, no, we're not doing this. This is for their benefit. Poor stupid folk. They wouldn't be able to even support themselves without our help. That's generally the way things go. And there's a whole lot of that. All right, let's talk about the origins of skin color for a moment. First, I want to introduce my crude diagram. I admit I can't draw, okay? The little yellow ball on the right is supposed to be the sun. The green one on the left is supposed to be the earth. And you're saying, but you know, the sun's about 1 million times bigger than the earth. But you'll remember it's 93 million miles away, so give me a break on that one. And the little blue around the green is supposed to be our atmosphere. I cheated again just so you could see it. Because if you want an analogy for how much atmosphere we really have, think of an apple and the skin of the apple. The skin of the apple is about how much atmosphere we have relative to the earth, and the skin of the apple relative to the apple. It's pretty thin. Not much between us and oblivion. But this diagram, I hope, helps us explain this a little bit. Pigmentation of an upper layer of the skin protects the body from folate depletion, I should add skin cancer here as well, caused by too much ultraviolet radiation. So we're concerned with where a population is on the earth and how much sunlight does it get, which means then how much ultraviolet radiation does it get. And you're going to get more around the equator. My little diagram is trying to suggest that. If you look carefully at the line that sort of heads to the equator, you can in your mind see, gee, if I extended that a little bit all the way to the earth, that would be shorter than if I took the sunlight that's hitting higher up, you know, near the poles, going through the atmosphere. It's got to go through a lot more atmosphere, and the ozone 3 and so on that's taking that away, getting rid of that ultraviolet, up there. So to protect one's self, one needs a darker skin, more melanin in their skin around the equator. Why do human beings ever do that? Because we're runners. We chase our prey. We don't always try and take them down right away. That's the way the Neanderthals did. They go in after the mastodon with a thrusting spear. Here you go, big buddy, and they're not happy about that when they get stuck. Okay. Homo sapiens became hairless by chasing animals across the savannah until those animals collapsed from overheating. They could not, with all their hair, pant enough, especially when they're running, they can't pant at all. And the human beings could, they could run 15, 20 miles. I mean, there's supper up there, folks. Let's go for it. And they would run those animals into the ground. But with hairless skin, and it's important to have that because that has the perspiration pores that would let you be not overheat when you're running down the animals. You've got to have a fair amount of pigmentation if you're going to be around the equator. And if you're far from the equator, there are some problems. A lower layer of skin, when struck by the ultraviolet, produces vitamin D, needed for good health, prevent bone diseases like rickets, and many other things. Vitamin D does a lot. Lighter skin color aided survival as people moved away from the equator where they received less ultraviolet radiation. Why less? Because their skin was dark. So they were cutting out too much and they're receiving less because the atmosphere was knocking it out. So there's a problem there. Well, you got to understand a little bit about the issue of evolution. And we're talking here only about specific evolution, how evolution goes in a specific area for a specific thing. And here we're talking about skin color. You're always going to, in every population, have a variety of genes. You're going to have some folks born around the equator, total albino. Well, they don't have much of a chance before. But folks who are a little bit light-skinned, still that wasn't so likely. You were going to be producing offspring because that wasn't going to work very well. But as you move further north, as people started coming out of Africa looking for other territories, then the dark skin became an impediment to survival. And those folks who are a little bit weird because they had a little bit light skin around the equator are now more likely to survive and pass along their genes until we get lighter and lighter. And the farther north you go, you see the lighter folks get. This was a survival thing. Sufficient pigmentation needed to protect folate and protect against skin cancer and yet allow vitamin D production was always the thing, depending upon where you were on the earth and how much sunlight you were getting there. Right? It seems to me like a strange reason to get yourself all heated up inside a white sheet and a little white cap and going out and burning crosses and, saying, take that, you people who got ancestors got their vitamin D different than ours. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. But, we've made up race and it's real to some people. So the higher up you are, the less ozone there is to filter away. And the nearer the equator, the more there is. And at higher elevations, there's going to be less filtering too from the atmosphere, right? So you need darker skin there if you're near the equator. All right, that's the skin color thing. Very few people really understand that. It was like there's these two different races, and one was black and one was white. Nobody's black and white. We've already talked about a gentleman who wrote a book with essays in it. One entitled Pink and Brown People. I mean, he took on this whole idea of black and white. All right, so ridiculous. Necessary, but ridiculous to discriminate against people for that. So-called Eskimos, such as the Inuit and the Yupik, they have significant keratin in their skin, not melanin, like blacks and whites. And that does a lot for Asians to protect them, particularly North South Asian, to protect them from too much ultraviolet. But when the Eskimos moved north, why didn't they lighten up? My class seldom get this. Anybody got an idea? Why didn't they lighten up? They needed vitamin D, right? That's the clue. Where else could you get it if you didn't get it from the sun? Well, fish, diet. It comes from diet. So there was no need for them to change. There was no evolutionary pressure on them. Nobody had greater survivability because they were lighter. Okay. How is it possible that people with skin color, incompatible with a particular area of the earth, can live in that area? How do we do it today? Oh, that's right. Sunscreen, clothing, stay in the air-conditioned bar during the day, and there's lots of solutions. Umbrellas. Skin color variation is a result of evolved adaptation of the incidence of ultraviolet radiation in specific habitats. That's all we got. That is not a reason to say you have no right to an education, which has been rampant in this country well into the 60s, and we still got problems. I want to show you a little video here about an idea we've already talked about. This is sort of like review, but it sort of fits the idea we're talking about today, or going to be talking about today. So let me see if I can get this going.
Anytime there's the us versus them, and the them is bad, and we paint these broad brush strokes against certain groups of people, everyone loses.
We all have biases. Some are racial, some are religious, and some have to do with other things like our favorite sports team. Most of us are aware of our biases, and we try not to let them affect how we view and treat others. But when we leave them unchecked, they become amplified. I sat with Dr. Ali Matu, psychologist and host of the YouTube series The Psych Show. He explained how the mind develops the kind of bias that leads to Islamophobia and the effect it has on our society. Explain what you think the psychology is behind Islamophobia.
There's this basic thing inside of us. It's called the in-group, out-group bias. No matter who we are, we really like the groups we belong to,
right,
and we dislike other groups. So it could be about race, but it could also be like Trekkies versus Star Wars fans. So you combine that with not really knowing another group of people, that kind of stuff can come together and form some of these biases,
right,
like Islamophobia. What really concerns me further, though, is what you're talking about here, about like how acceptable statements have become.
Right.
The more you can kind of excuse and keep someone as this other and not really have to deal with it, that is a very dangerous road. One of the other things that really concerns me right now is this thing called group polarization. When people are in groups and there aren't a lot of diverse perspectives in the group, their views become much more extreme.
Right.
A feed of information, your Twitter feed, your Facebook feed. There's someone from high school I'm friends with on Facebook, and they post some like super heinous thing, and I'm like, block. But like your feed becomes more and more polarized, right, where it's more and more people who just agree with you. And actually, this is how terrorism is born too, where a small group of people only are interacting with each other, and their views and their thoughts get warped and more polarized and more extreme.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the biggest hurdles we have as a species.
Bias within and between social groups can feed the dangerous logic that drives Islamophobia, racism, and terrorism. Empathy and acceptance are the best weapons we have in the fight against ignorance. So let's use them.
We as Americans have really the land of the free, home of the brave. We just stop there and say, oh, that's it. We're for democracy and everyone here is equal and you're free to do whatever you want, but that's not necessarily the case.
Oops, I started again. Here we go. So just as review, what was said there is that it's really us versus them, in-group, out-group bias. It's held more strongly by persons who are very authoritarian, but everybody can do it. This bias, plus not knowing real people in the out-group, can lead to various forms of terrorism, including Islamophobia. Group polarization can lead to extremist ideologies. You know, if you're only talking to folks in your bubble, it can get really nutty, because if you're not paying attention to the evidence and just whoever is giving the latest idea. Empathy and acceptance, I agree with the young man in the video, are the best weapons we have in the fight against ignorance. I want to give you an example that I found in the Courier Journal. It was just a reprint there it was from another paper, but it so illustrates what I'm trying to say here. So let me tell you the story. The antagonist, Ann Atwater, was one. The article described her as a bombastic black welfare mother who organized poor blacks into political force. Whoa, she's bombastic. All right. And C.P. Ellis, leader of the Durham, North Carolina Ku Klux Klan. Well, his views are a little different than hers, that's for sure. Atwater didn't like him, or most whites for that matter. That's a quote from Atwater. CP kept calling me the N-word, and I kept calling him cracker. They were not getting along. Then came the grant. In 1971, the AFL-CIO, this is a big overall labor organization of many other unions under it, awarded a grant to the school system to help school and community leaders figure out how to improve the relationships and performance of the schools. Ellis, by then the exultant Cyclops, or president of the Durham Klan, and Atwater were named co-chairpersons of the committee? My Lord, what should they have done? Well, they didn't want to lose the grant. It was important to them and the type of people they served. What drew them closer were a few small personal gestures. Atwater protected Ellis's display of Klan materials, robes and hoods and brochures, from about 15 black teenagers who wanted to destroy it. Instead, she told them to read the brochures and understand those who hated them. Well, he thought, geez, that's kind of interesting that she would do that. At the same time, Ellis's wife brought meals of soup and collard greens to Atwater's house each morning so that her children, and that's probably for both of them, could eat during the meetings. I mean, they had no office space. They were meeting in Atwater's house in the morning before work. And Ellis's wife was bringing food for all the kids. So that seemed nice. Eventually, they decided to work together. The relationship was cemented one day when each revealed their children were being taunted at school because of their parents' work and were being treated differently by teachers because they were poor. Not that uncommon. I said, he got the same problems I got. We got to work together. That was Atwater's point of view. Now, here they are, 30 years and more than 30 pounds later, as good friends. It's an unlikely relationship. What did Ellis see as the source of his problems in the beginning? Race. Those folks of the bad race who were screwing everything up. The mob at the gates, coming to knock down our little gates and take what little we have. What did both eventually come to see as the major source of their problems, though? Class. It was class. The result of the system of relationships within the political economy of the society. I know that's a little rich for you, political economy, but we don't have just economics and we don't have just politics. They're always intertwined. And nobody wants to talk about that intertwining because it's very nice to have them separate, and then those folks who do best in that system don't have to be held accountable. But it all goes together. And these people figured it out. The resolution: Ellis tore up his Klan membership card For many years afterward, he organized labor unions for working class blacks and whites. He had seen the light. Over the past 30 years, both Ellis and Atwater have undergone an amazing transformation, coming to see each other as human beings and forging the unlikeliest of friendships. All right. In emphasizing their supposed racial differences early in their relationship, I mean, they were both really wed to, it's all about race. In that early part of the relationship, Ellis and Atwater, what were they doing by emphasizing their race? Were they, one, making it possible for each one's race to get the most help from society possible? Were they, two, dealing with their most pressing and important problems? Or three, effectively canceling each other's efforts for improving the situation for the lower class? I gotta go with the last one. You either work together or you're not going very far. The whole idea is to keep us from working together. Often Americans, particularly authoritarians, find their mob at the gates to be racial minorities. Today, our focus on supposed races still causes us to overlook the more important influence on our lives of social class. We'll talk a lot about that next time. All right. I think I can do this. All right. African Americans represent approximately what percent of all drug users in the USA? Take all the drug users, what percent of them are African Americans? Would it be 14%, 24, 34, 54, 74? Anybody for 14? We have a bunch of you. Fairly knowledgeable. That is correct. What is interesting about that percentage for African Americans? Oh, okay, yeah. I think almost all of you are saying is that is basically their population percentage, about 13%. The whole thought behind the drug war, and Nixon and Reagan sort of set this off, and they were really committed to this, that it's the blacks who are screwing over the society with their drugs. They're the users. Never was the case. I mean, more so than whites. So who are the users? Well, the data shows that's another story. African Americans represent about what percent of all arrests for drugs in the USA? Are they, of all the arrests, do African Americans make up 20%, 30, 40, 50, or 60%? D, 50? Yeah. E, 60? I think the data actually shows 50. It could be a little more than 50. And also, it's going to vary about where you are. So this is an average for the whole country. But it doesn't matter whether it's 50 or 60. There's only 14% of them users. Why are they being arrested? Why do they make up a huge proportion, actually the largest proportion of the American prison population, which is greater than any other prison population in the world, even China, which has 4 times as many people as we do? It goes back to something I want to work on now. So I want to talk about a study here of a person who rode along in a police car and asked a lot of questions and wrote things up as to what was going on as follows. The person says, his name is Glenn, says a police officer's career and even annual income is determined by the number of good collars, that is, arrests that culminate in conviction. You arrest somebody and you don't get a conviction, that's not good, that officer makes. From the perspective of the police, the more serious the offense, the better. You get more credit for that. A stream of politicians have described drug use as a serious crime. Sometimes giving life sentences. That's crazy. Drug arrests are among the easiest to make. Convictions are not difficult to obtain. And drug convictions often lead to the longest prison terms. The average length of time served in state and federal prisons for drug offenses is almost 7 years. An arrest, and here's where we really get into the sociology of this, or why it works the way it works. An arrest is organizationally effective. I mean, it's good for the organization. It makes the organization better. It's effective only if the person arrested is relatively powerless. Arrests of white, male, middle-class offenders on college campuses, for example, or in law offices on Wall Street are guaranteed to cause the organization and the arresting officers strain because people with political influence and money hire attorneys to defend them. Arrests of poor black men, however, and actually counts for a lot of women too, however, result in nothing but gains for the organization and the officer because the cases are quickly processed through the courts. A guilty plea obtained and the suspect is sentenced. Organizations reward members whose behavior maximizes gains and minimizes strains for the organization. So if you're a little low on your arrests this month, where do you go to make some arrests? A black neighborhood maybe. How much trouble could they cause? Corrupting influences on many police departments. The Byrne Act and federal grants reward departments for drug arrests. This goes back to these crazy extreme libertarian nonsense of markets solve all problems, and Democrats came to believe that after about 20 years of this crap. And so they have gone along and said, we'll incentivize these officers to make more arrests. They get a reward for doing so, not some little nonsensical thing they can pin on their uniform, but SWAT teams and tanks, and, well, not quite that, but you know, they got weapons and so on from the military. Lots of arrangements were made. And you could hire extra officers if you're bringing in a lot of this grant money from the Byrne Act and so on. Now, these incentives were passed by Congress. And I've just explained this one to you as special rewards to incentivize the police. Minority poor are easiest to arrest and prosecute. Even an officer who sees such arrest as perverse and biased way of enforcing the drug laws will feel great pressure from his or her department to pursue the arrests that bring this federal money to the department. It's the federal money that has become perverse. Officers should be arresting people who are breaking the law, not scamming the system to see how much money they can make out of it, which has been an assault on African Americans and Hispanics that is just incredible. More about that, mass conviction. Now, I'm taking most of this data and most of the ideas from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, 1912. And here's a little bit of data she presented. Approximately 500,000 people are in prison or jail for drug offenses today. That was 2006, compared to 41,000 in 1980. I mean, there's that huge jump from 41,000 to 500,000, a 1,100% increase as the drug laws from the 80s and so on were being enforced and ramped up with the Byrne grants and that kind of stuff. So, folks, we're getting arrested all right. 4 out of 5 drug arrests are for possession only. We're not getting many of the dealers because they all count equal. So you want to get up your federal scores, you arrest anybody who's got a little bit of this or that on them. Mostly, the arrestee pleads guilty rather than face extreme charges and potential extreme sentences. Here is prosecutorial malpractice. Your prosecutor can then run for office again and say, I had this many arrests and blah, blah, blah. But how did he get those convictions? He got those convictions because he told a mother of 3 kids, I found drugs were found in your apartment, probably left there by somebody else. In one case, it was totally innocent woman. And you are either going to admit that and plead guilty, or you're going to prison for 30 years. Who's going to look after my children? That is your problem. You have a choice, though. You could admit that you did it. She admitted. It's the only thing she could think to do at the time. She had no legal representation. She didn't know the consequences of admitting it. And of course, if she'd have gone ahead with the trial, she would have been convicted. That was pretty well rigged. You're not supposed to be, but it tends to go that way against African Americans. So most people caught with drugs will plead guilty as soon as the prosecutor says, here's your choice. Human Rights Watch reported in the year 2000 that in 7 states, African Americans constituted 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. Now, this is 14% of the users, 50% of the arrests, and 80 to 90% who actually go to prison. And sometimes the prison needs them. If it's a for-profit prison and they have empty beds, they could use a few more convictions. The National Household Survey on Drug Abuse reported in the year 2000 that white youth aged 12 to 17 are more than a third more likely to have sold illegal drugs than African American youth. It's easier for white kids because there's not so many folks chasing them down. White students use cocaine at 7 times the rate of black students, crack at 8 times, heroin at 7 times, according to National Institute on Drug Abuse data cited in 2000. 7+ million people behind bars or on probation or on parole at any one time in the United States. The proportion of those persons who are black makes up the very large segment of the black population in the U.S. I mean, it's really huge. If you get out of prison after so many years, somebody else goes in, but then all of you have a record. Ruined lives. Prison admissions for African Americans for the year 2000 increased by 26 times since 1983. This is the drug war and the market solution to it. Latinos 22 times and whites 8 times. Persons have been traumatized and killed by no-knock searches by SWAT teams. You know, so many departments now have their SWAT team. They never had money for it before, but now they got all this federal money. They can have SWAT teams. And instead of, taking a chance of kicking down a door with a guy with a handgun, they're going in with full semi-automatic rifles. And sometimes they'll throw in a shock grenade, just blast without any shrapnel. A baby was killed one time that it landed in the baby's crib. Once convicted of a crime, even without prison time, but placed on probation, one is a felon in most states. And one loses the following: the right to vote and the right to serve on a jury. Oh, well, okay, that's too bad. We don't want felons doing that. Oh, no. Jobs, as most felons have to declare as a felon on the job application. Now, wait a minute. You come out of prison, you got whatever, $20, $100 a suit maybe, and you're told you're on your own. And don't go back and associate with other people who have a conviction. How are you going to make a living? You have a felony on your record. A lot of these folks start out just as kids. They're easier to, the young ones easier to take in and as arrests. No skills anyway, probably no jobs available, but what jobs there are, probably can't get them because you got a felony record on your record. Food stamps and public housing. So the mother who was, gave that plea of guilty, thinking, okay, maybe I'll get less, and she was put on probation. But now she was kicked out of her public housing and she couldn't get food stamps. So how was she to support the kids? And private landlords usually do that as well. Licenses for a wide range of professions. You know, maybe you wanted to be a barber, or a hairstylist, or something. Nope, sorry, can't get a license. You got a felony. Returning to crime is sometimes seen as the only way to survive. Within 3 years, nearly 68% of this sample they're looking at were rearrested at least once for a new offense. Could we design a worse system for the victims? No. Could we design a better system for the for-profit folk who take capitalism to an extreme? No, this is working great for them. This is great for everybody but the person arrested and their relatives and their friends. Conservative reaction to change? Well, under Nixon, the South turns back to Republicans over civil rights and busing. I mean, that's fairly well known at this point. The party of Lincoln was not for the South anymore because the Democrats had been too lenient on blacks. Congress, and women too, that's another problem they had. Congress in 1970 and Nixon in 71 launched the war on drugs. There were people worried about the war on drugs. I sent my kid to this fancy school with this high tuition and he's strung out on heroin now. You got to do something. I mean, there are real issues here, but the reaction is always a war. Americans declare war on everything. Cancer, other people, drugs. What if we decided we would look to what the Europeans have done and figure out how they do so much better on this? No, it's ridiculous. They're a bunch of damn socialists. They don't know anything. We Americans know everything. End of story. Lock them up. 1980s, Reagan campaigns against black welfare queens. He was quite a racist, but he didn't want to say it out in the open, but close enough. The poor seen as black and as undeserving, you know, having a bad culture. That's what did him in. You know, we talked about the street culture before, how people will react after so many years of going nowhere and just give up and do everything for themselves. It comes out to be a very ugly culture. So, I mean, in a sense, they had it right, but really, they had created that culture with extreme inequality that made it that way and made it even worse for blacks and other minorities. Attracts laborers who had been New Deal Democrats, but now they didn't want to see blacks and women getting anywhere. Now they were bearing the brunt of the changes promoted by the civil rights movement. You know, the middle class whites, well, we're all for this stuff. We ought to, you know, have better schools for blacks and so on. I hope they can pull it off because we're moving to the suburbs and our money goes to our local school. Too bad for the rest of you. But if you're a laborer and you can't afford to move, you are suddenly in a situation where you find, oh, I think I hate these people and now I have to stay there. That's just going to make it worse. There was no attempt to help us deal with racism in the schools or any place else. It was just, there's where you go. That's it. October 1982, Reagan launches his own massive war on drugs. Huge increase in federal funding. One study indicates that as late as 1970, more than 70% of all blacks working in metropolitan areas held blue-collar jobs. That was true here in Louisville. There was industry. People were working. Oh, how could that be? You know, blacks are thugs and they never want to work. When the jobs go away, it's really hard to, you know, relocate and get another job. Things can become difficult. Yet by 1987, when the drug war hit high gear, the industrial employment of black men had plummeted to 28%, from 70 to 28. That's going to screw up a whole community. And you add the drug war to that with people with felonies. And I think Michelle Alexander is right. It's the new Jim Crow. Blacks have never had a shot. Maybe 10 years after the end of the Civil War, when the U.S. military allowed some blacks to run for political office and so on. And then President Johnson made a deal and pulled them out, and it was very racist. And the Klan arose, and that was the end of anything of getting ahead for African Americans. Till now, I mean, we've got some folks since the Civil Rights Movement who've been able to get an education and get ahead, but a whole lot of folks who are in dire, dire trouble not having managed that. So the war on drugs has become the new Jim Crow. Lawmakers and enforcers do not consider this war racist because they are supposedly dealing with real criminals. There's no racial bias here. It's just we arrest the folks who have the drugs. That's all it is. However, all the incentives for the war have a larger impact on blacks and Hispanics than on whites by a long shot. The damage done to blacks and Hispanics is so devastating that white supremacists and nationalists can look at the resulting dysfunction that you can find in those communities and blame it on race. You know, it's their genes. They're subhuman. We expect them to do that, rather than they have been targeted. Not because of their race so much as their inability to fight back and make a good collar. Got to have those good collars. It's the war on drugs. Has not stopped people from using drugs. Been an absolute failure. Has caused billions of dollars worth of damage to the nation. Has kept many blacks and Hispanics in a living hell. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. And has helped keep the white middle and lower classes under the thumb of the rich and the super rich by focusing on the need of whites to control non-whites instead of undivided middle and lower classes working together as a countervailing power to the wealthy. You see what I'm saying? That whites are very big losers in racism. They don't lose as much as the people who are targeted. So, you know, African Americans are probably the biggest population, or Hispanics, pretty big population. They don't lose quite that much, but they lose a lot. They don't know how screwed over they are, but they're willing to fight against this horrid race that would take over the country. And that black president who would have done us all in actually served quite nicely in the worst downturn we'd had since the Great Depression, caused by the wealthy. Their greed was so great that even when some of their employees warned them, like on Wall Street, about what they were doing, they wouldn't stop. They just kept going until maybe they lost their bank. This was one of them. You know.